Good
evening, sir.
Good evening,
Good
sir.
evening. Good evening, Shivam. Good evening, Riya. Let's start. I hope you had the chance to read the text, Lord Jim. It is a small text, but it's not easy reading. I agree. But this is how the texts in paper 2 going to be. Passage to India was the easiest, most accessible text. But then we have Lord Jim. We'll have a portrait of the artist, portrait of an artist as a young man. We have Virginia Woolf's text. We have Sons and Lovers. We have House of Mr. Biswas. And maybe you'd be happy with Kantapura, Raja Rao's Kantapura. That might come across as the easier one. And then the poetry section as well, T.S. Eliot, Auden, W. Yeats, and Ramanujan. Looks like the easier part, but is not. So brace yourself for some of the most complicated classics of English literature. So if we master this paper 2, and that's the reason I start with paper 2, because we have more literary concepts in paper 2, and when we go to paper 1, it'll be a cakewalk. Basically, comparatively, you'll feel that it's much easier, much more accessible, apart from the 2 long poems. Let's quickly go through the basics of Joseph Conrad and Lord Jim. As I said, he was born in Poland, 1857. So he grew up in Victorian Europe. And he wrote in many languages. He spent a lot of time. So the one thing that we need to be, that's relevant to us. Sorry, I'm just hitting different buttons. One thing that's relevant to us is he is considered to be an early modernist. We'll try to find out some elements of modernism from this text. He grew up in the Victorian Europe. He spent a lot of time close to the empire, spent a lot of time on maritime ships and commercial ships belonging to the empire, different countries, different shipping companies. Can anyone tell me his most famous work?
Heart of Darkness.
Heart of Darkness. So, have you read Heart of Darkness?
Yes, sir.
Heart of Darkness is more famous and it's more popular. It's part of most syllabuses of BA and MA around the world. Lord Jim is less famous, less popular, and I was really excited to see this part of UPSC syllabus. Lord Jim brings certain specific element relevant to our syllabus, especially the idea of modernism, because he is one of the earliest modernists in our syllabus. So this book came out in 1901, 1902, turn of the century, and that is a very important, turn of the century is very important time for modernism, because a lot of things around the world changed at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century. Can any one of you, based on your general knowledge or anything that you've read, tell me some things that were era changing or landmark events that happened towards the end of 19th century and at the beginning of 20th century, before the First World War and at the end of the 19th century. We'll talk about these at length when we'll do the chapter on modernism, which I plan to do in the next class. Can anything that comes to your mind, comes to your head, any event, any scientific discovery, anything in literature, culture, anything that happened? No? Have you heard of Charles Darwin?
Yes, sir.
And what's his
A
book?
little, sir.
His treatise, what is it called? The book on
Origin of
evolution,
species.
Origin of Species. So that came towards
Theory of
the end.
evolution.
Origin of Species came towards the end of the century. And how is that important? How did that change the world? The idea of evolution, how did that, why was it a landmark thing to happen at that time? Any ideas? No. Okay, so
So
that
because
was,
it
yeah,
broke,
yeah, tell me.
so because it broke the religious ideas that people had, like the staunch Christian beliefs, they said that we evolved from monkeys.
Okay, yes, your voice is not clear, but I think what you're saying is it was a big scientific discovery of the scientific temperament and the scientific idea. And it basically said that man was not created by God in 7 days, as per the Bible. And it gave an idea of evolution that happened over thousands or millions of years, over a very long time. So the concept of the biblical God creating the world in 7 days, or creating Adam out of his ribs, and then Adam creating Eve, all that became a bit weak. That religious narrative became a bit weak. Now we had a counter scientific narrative based on scientific empirical research, right? The idea of evolution. It answered a lot of questions. So that was one major thing. Another major thing also happened in science. That was a guy called Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein proposed his ideas sometimes in 1905. And his theory of relativity, of different theories on light, wave. We'll talk about these, why these are relevant to literature and why these are relevant to the social scene at that time. So a lot of important events were happening at that time that changed the way world existed. So modernism was an age where the old ideas and old beliefs were being shattered, like completely shattered, right? And on the social, cultural, economical, geographical, political, on all these levels, world was finding new ideas. So modernist writers like Virginia Woolf, they formed a group called the Bloomsbury Group, if you might have heard of it. Virginia Woolf's husband was part of it. I think James Joyce was part of it. Auden might have been part of it. A lot of European authors and poets were part of that group, and their whole mission was to create new ways of expressing the world that they're living in now, which is very different from the Victorian times in every possible way. So in terms of literature, they wanted to create something new. That actually was a tagline that Virginia Woolf used, to create something new, to make something new. The old ways of telling stories, the Victorian ways of telling stories, was not going to work, because they are now living in a world which is very unstable, as opposed to the stability of modern Victorian times. In Victorian times, there was a queen that ruled for almost 50, 60 years. and it was the peak of the British Raj. So everything was, at least on the surface, was good and stable. And now Britain lost a lot of wars towards the end of the century in South Africa, in America, and the British Raj was weakening. The cracks were very visible, and they knew it's just a matter of time before the biggest colony, India, would be gone. So the cracks all over in terms of the way people were living. The First World War was brewing for at least 20 years. A power center was shifting in Europe. The, the power center of religion, Vatican, Catholicism, was already shaken by the British Queen, Queen Victoria, when she established the Church of England, right? So the Church of England became its own entity. It became the center of Catholicism or Christianity in England. So now, obviously, they were still associated with the Vatican and the Pope, but now they had Queen or the king, the monarch was going to be the head of the Church of England. So the religious power structure was being tempered, the political power structure was in fluid state. So everything was changing. The world was in the most unstable stage people knew at that time. So this literature, this modernist literature, was trying to make sense of it. And they knew that the older ways of storytelling is not going to work with what we're witnessing now. That's why even in the arts, we have Picasso. We have the idea of Cubism and Impressionism. And new literary techniques had to be devised, which the modernist writers worked upon, like stream of consciousness is one, which we talked about yesterday. New narrative style had to be found. Now, I asked you yesterday the narrative technique in this text, the first few chapters and the rest of the book. So what have you noticed? Tell me one by one. Ria, what have you noticed?
Sir, that it's a very complicated text. I didn't understand half of it.
Okay. Okay. Shivam?
Sir, I just noticed like it's jumping from the fictional aspect to the narrative aspect, like autobiographical aspect from time to time. So it's just like the godly aspect that we talk about in fiction. So it just got changed into the autobiographical aspect. So I was seeing that he was expressing things by using different objective aspects of characters, so that we can get the gist of each and every aspect.
Okay. Okay. That's a good observation. Ranbir, what do you think?
Yes, I don't know too much, but I can see that there are signs of Orientalism, but also there is a differentiation between Indian and European. Like there's a mention of half-caste Portuguese person and how they portray the German characters. And I can also see that as a theme that the expectations are changed. When they consider Lord Jim as one of them and considering themselves as superior or someone of a very high moral character.
Okay. Not a bad start. The narrative technique employed in the Victorian novels like of Jane Austen, George Eliot, the text that we have in the syllabus, Henry Fielding, or anything you might have read, older books, Thomas Hardy. If you haven't read, so I can tell you, there used to be an omniscient narrator. So there would be a narrator who is not part of the book's character world. So he or she is like a voiceover. You see in certain films, there is a voiceover that explains to you what is happening, the background, the flashback, who's who, and all that. So there used to be such narrator, omniscient narrator, in the Victorian text. Now, in the modernist text, the first thing that happened is they realized that we can only have characters who are part of the story. So only the characters can drive the story forward. Why do we need an omniscient external narrator? Who is this person? So in Lord Jim, the first few chapters until the court case, the story is told from the point of an omniscient narrator. So whosoever is telling you the story when the story starts, description of Jim, his background, the affair, the Patna affair, who's telling you that? This is an omniscient narrator. That is a Victorian style of writing. But as soon as we are introduced to the character Marlowe in the courtroom, he's sitting behind and he looks at Jim and he observes everything. The rest of the story is told from the point of view of Marlowe. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Did
sir.
you notice that?
Yes, sir, definitely.
Yeah. So the first few chapters, there is an omniscient narrator. There is no character who's describing. It's not in the first person. It's not in the third person. It's in the third person. But there is no character who's narrating with that. It's an omniscient narrator, non-existent omniscient narrator. But as soon as Marlowe takes over, it's him. So he is telling all the information that we receive past that point comes through Marlowe. And Marlowe also tells us how he's receiving this information. There is a method to it, right? Because if Marlowe would tell everything about James' life from that point onwards, he'd end up becoming an omniscient narrator. How does he know everything about his life? So Joseph Conrad as an author, and this is one of the features of modernism. That's why we call him an early modernist. This is one flash of modernist brilliance, that Joseph Conrad is aware of this problem, that if Marlowe tells everything about Jim's life, then he'll be just like any Victorian narrator, an omniscient narrator who knows everything. How the hell does he know everything? Because that's the question. That's the question modernist authors are asking. So how does Joseph Conrad solves that question? The question that how Marlowe knows everything about Jim. How is that question solved? That problem is solved by Conrad. Anyone? What happens towards the end of, okay, let me take you, let's quickly hold on to this idea. Let's quickly go through this presentation. We have characters: Jim, Captain Marlowe, Montague Bradley, Stein, Cornelius, Doramin, Dane Warris, Captain Brown, and Jewel. These are some of the most important concepts. All your preparation around on Lord Jim should be around these concepts. Narrative technique employed by Conrad, and we'll talk about it. Is Lord Jim simply about young British lad Jim's aspirations to become a colonial lord? So what is the theme of the story? The whole book is a development of one situation. What is that situation and how is it important? This is referring to the Patna affair, the sinking of the Patna ship. Elaborate upon the view that colonialism alienates both the native and the settler alike, as is shown by Conrad and Lord Jim. So in this text, we look at the other side of colonialism. In Passage to India, A.M. Foster tried to show how colonialism adversely affects the natives, right? This text shows both sides of the story, focusing, in fact, more on the settler or the colonizer. This text shows you how the colonizer is as much, if not more, impacted and affected by this whole colonial setup. And how Captain Briley's suicide is significant to understand the theme of the novel. His suicide might come across as just one of the events, but there is huge significance of that event. What is that? So let's try and find the text. I'm going to open the text. Okay. Where is it? It's somewhere. Here it is. Can you see the text? Is it big enough?
Yes.
Just
You
this.
must have your own text as well. This is just for reference. So starting with chapter 1, he was an inch, perhaps 2, under 6 feet, powerfully built, and he advanced straight at you with a slight stoop of the shoulders, head forward and a fixed from under stare, which made you think of a charging bull. So the description of Jim starts, and can you tell me the first time his name was disclosed? Third paragraph. Can you see? Third paragraph, somewhere here. Until then, he is just used with the pronoun. He was just Jim. Here. Jim the water clerk. Yeah. And then he lived his life as in incognito. These are some important phrases to understand. They called him Tuan Jim or Lord Jim. So in 3 paragraphs, he's given you a snapshot of the story. But who's telling you these things? This is an omniscient narrator. This is a Victorian style of telling. So he builds up a picture of Jim's life, kind of factual stuff that happened to him. Then in chapter 2, after 2 years of training, he went to sea, and entering the region so well known to his imagination, found them strangely barren of adventure. This is an extremely important line. He made many voyages. He knew the magic monotony of existence between sky and water. He had to bear the criticism of men, the exactions of the sea, and the prosaic severity of the daily task that gives bread, but whose only reward is in the perfect love of the work. This reward eluded him. Yet he could not go back, because there is nothing more enticing, disenchanting, and enslaving than the life at sea. Besides, his prospects were good. He was gentlemanly, steady, tractable, with a thorough knowledge of his duties, and in time, when yet very young, he became chief mate of a fine ship. Without ever having been tested by those events of the sea that show in the light of day the inner worth of a man, the edge of his temper and the fiber of his stuff, that reveal the quality of his resistance and the secret truth of his pretenses, not only to others, but also to himself. This first paragraph is extremely important to understand the theme of the book. The first line tells you the reason why he joined this trade. He was a young lad in England, and at that time, at the peak of the British Raj, the maritime soldiers were the heroes. The soldiers, the foot soldiers of the British Empire. There was a guy called Lord Nelson. Lord Nelson, if you Google him or Wikipedia him, you'll find that Lord Nelson was almost revered as a god. He was imagined by people. They were folklores around him, and he was a real guy, Lord Nelson. He was imagined to be having 10 limbs. In such heroic fashion, he was described. There were stories of his valor and heroics. So every young lad in England at that time, they aspired to be part of this British Empire's adventurous, whole ecosystem. Right? That's how his childhood went. If you remember, it's mentioned at multiple places. Growing up, he read those adventurous stories, and he wanted to be part of that to prove his mettle. And this first line, after 2 years of training, he went to sea, and entering the region so well known to his imagination, found them strangely barren of adventure. right? This is his story. This one sentence actually covers his story. He came out with a lot of adventure and imagination in his head, having read all those stories, fictionalized stories, fantasies written and presented to allure people like Jim, to young people like Jim. We talked about in the post-colonial narrative, the complexity of the post-colonial narrative. One of the ideas was, how do you get young people to fight for you and give their life? Yeah, this was one way for the empire to recruit young soldiers, 18-year-old kids willing to come, live on the sea and die, perish. So this whole affair of British Empire's adventures around the world, they presented these adventures as heroic so that people would aspire and come and join. But what happened to Jim? Regions so well known to his imagination found them strangely barren of adventure. He made many voyages. He knew the magic monotony of existence between sky and water. He had to bear. So once he actually experienced the life on the ship, he realized the reality, the stark reality of life. And he did not love his work. This reward eluded him. But he could not go back because there is nothing more enticing, disenchanting and enslaving than the life itself. Another thing that happened, he was made a chief mate of a fine ship. That is almost like a captain, second in command to a captain. And he was only very young, 18 or 20 years of age. And without ever having been tested by those events. So he was given a responsibility bigger than himself. And what happened? He failed, right? When the Patna, the ship he was the chief mate of, it sank or almost sank, and he jumped to save his life. That happens in chapter 3. Now, can you see this line? So
Yes.
who were on board? What was the profile of the passengers on this ship? Who were these people? They were the pilgrims going to Makkah. They were the Arabs. Yeah. And look at how they are described by the German captain. Look at these cattle, right? Everyone remembers the phrase cattle class used by Mr. Shashi Tharoor some time back. So cattle class or cattle was a very derogatory but commonly used word by the British, by the colonizers to describe Indians or the natives, right? These are pilgrims and they paid for the ticket, but the captain and the chief mate, this is how they look at them. So the idea of Orientalism in play. Do you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
So not only is he young and inexperienced, now we're looking at his problems. He's young. He's definitely not experienced or capable enough to manage a ship, but he was given the chance. And he's living in a world of imagination of those heroics and valor. He's still holding on to that idea. And now when he's become the chief mate, it is for him, it is a chance to show his bravery and heroics. And he has a very colonial mindset, very colonial mindset. Colonial narrative has got a hold of him. He looks at these people not as passengers or customers or clients, but as the inferior Easterns. Hmm? Chapter 3 is very beautifully written, and it tells you what's happening. A marvelous stillness pervaded the world, and the stars, together with the serenity of their rays, seemed to shed upon the earth the assurance of everlasting security. Assurance of everlasting security. What does this tell you? Remember Passage to India? The strength comes from the sun. Hmm? Who's giving this assurance of everlasting security?
The British Empire.
Yes, the empire, the soldier of the British Empire, Mr. Jim, the chief mate, and the ship. The young moon, recurved and shining low in the west, was like a slender shaving thrown up from a bar of gold, and the Arabian Sea, smooth and cool to the eye like a sheet of ice, extended its perfect level to the perfect circle of a dark horizon. What a beautiful scene. The propeller turned without a check, as though its beat had been part of the scheme of a safe universe. Yeah. And on each side of the Patna, two deep folds of water, permanent and somber on the unwrinkled shiver, enclosed within their straight and diverging ridges. A few white swirls of foam bursting in low hiss, a few wavelets, a few ripples, a few undulations that left behind, agitated the surface of the sea for an instant out of the passage of the ship, subsided splashing gently, calmed down at last into circular stillness of water and sky with the black speck of moving hull remaining everlastingly in its center. Jim on the bridge was penetrated by the great certitude of unbounded safety and peace. Do you see it? Can you see Orientalism in play? Great certitude of unbounded safety and peace that could be read on the silent aspect of nature, like the certitude of fostering love upon the placid tenderness of a mother's face. Below the roof of awnings, surrendered to the wisdom of white men. How clear it is. Surrender to the wisdom of white Yeah, I'm back on. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so did you understand what I just talked about? Can you spot Jim's Oriental dichotomic inclinations? He's only 18 or 20, and this is how he thinks. Can you see that? The great
Yes.
certitude of unbounded safety, nature like the gate. Then the pilgrims are surrendered. I am really sorry. It's really irritating. Are you back in? Are you still listening?
Yes, sir.
Sorry for that. It's just. Okay. Yes, so everyone understands what I talked about so far, how Jim's psychological makeup is. We're trying to build a profile of Jim. And once you understand it, everything will make sense of this book. So things that we've understood so far, he's a young kid. He grew up in England. At that time, British Empire was at its peak, and the heroics of the British soldiers, especially the British Navy and the maritime soldiers, for example, Lord Nelson, their heroics and valor was the stuff of legends, and every young kid, young boy wanted to be like them. So there was a lot of imagination instilled in their heads so that they become aspired to join the British Empire and become foot soldiers. So he joined. He realized very soon that this is a completely different world, but he had no option to go back. That those this chapter 2 first paragraph is very important to understand and build a psychological profile. Why did he not go back? Why could he not go back? That's an important thing about his personality, because this, even though this is almost slavery, monotonous, tougher than he expected, no adventure in it, it's not like what he imagined. This is more enticing, disenchanting, and enslaving than life at sea. There is nothing more enticing than this. So nobody is stopping him, nobody is forcing him to be here. But these are the reasons he could not go back. Now, chapter 3 gives us a glimpse into his colonial mindset, where he considered these passengers to be second-rate citizens, the inferior, the Oriental dichotomy. They are surrendered to the wisdom of white men and to their courage, like this line here. Trusting the power of their unbelief and the iron shell of their fire ship, the pilgrims of an exacting faith slept on mats, blankets, bare planks on every deck. All equal before sleep, death's brother. So, white men, superior. He felt like a Lord Nelson walking that ship in charge of these pilgrims who are trusting him for his valor, the white valor of white men. With these ideas in mind, now you have some psychological profile of Jim, right? Yeah,
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
right. Now, this guy who wanted to be a hero, who felt whose chest was puffing when he was on board a ship in charge of all these passengers, eastern cattle, and he was like on the top of the world. Finally, he had an opportunity. And what happens? What happens now?
He fails on his own standards.
He fails. He fails. He has to jump the ship to save his life, because the captain was too drunk when the ship encountered a problem. The engines got stuck and everything, and he felt that the ship is going down. The captain was missing. He was too drunk to do anything. He was in charge, and he panicked, and he was scared for his life, and he escaped. Hmm? So a man who wanted to be a hero realized and found out that he's a coward. Now, how come that be? That is a very difficult thing for him to believe and accept. So this is what happens in chapter 4, the court case. He was asked about all that. Hmm? And in this chapter, you can see his state of mind. The last paragraph of chapter 4, the second last. He saw a man in the courtroom, the only man who, if he felt, believed what he was going through. That man there seemed to be aware of his hopeless difficulty. Jim looked at him, then turned away resolutely as after a final parting. And later on, many times in distant parts of the world, Marlowe showed himself willing to remember Jim, to remember him at length, in detail and audibly. Perhaps it would be after dinner on a veranda draped in motionless foliage and crowned with flowers in the deep dusk speckled by fiery cigar ends. The elongated bulk of each cane chair harbored a silent listener. Now and then a small red glow would move abruptly, and expending light up the fingers of a languid hand, part of a face in profound repose, or a flash crimson gleam, fragment of an underwear, blah blah blah. So, chapter 5 onwards, this is how the story was told. To read this sentence. Many times in distant parts of the world, Marlowe showed himself willing to remember Jim, to remember him at length, in detail and audibly. So Marlowe became the topic of, Jim became the topic of Marlowe's gossips in various parts of the world, in various settings with various people. That's how the rest of the book comes to us. Right? You see that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Now is it a little clearer? Yeah. So now we understand Jim's problem a bit. When the book starts, chapter 1, it's the present, not the present time, but it's a time before he was dead, because he dies when he became Lord Jim. But between the Patna affair, after the court case, and until he became a Lord Jim, he spent time as a water clerk. That is, spending time not on the ships, but as a desk clerk in the shipping companies, on the beaches, or not beaches, on the shipping lines, postal offices, as almost an incognito. Everyone knew about his story, and he did not like to discuss his story. So he spent time quietly talking to no one, just doing his work and going through the motions. That's how he spent his middle years. That's where Marlowe got to know him better. Marlowe met him many times during that time. So what started with the Patna affair ends with him as a Lord Jim. Now, one of the questions that is conceptually important is why he chose to become a hero again, to be a Lord Jim. What happens in the end? What happens in Patusan? End mein kya hua? How did he die? Because it's a full circle, starting from Patna, and it goes and it ends on the similar lines, but he feels redeemed. What happens in Patusan? How did he die? What was that part of his life? Anyone? Ria?
Sorry, sir, I haven't finished the text, but I think he died saving the son of the chief.
Yes, he dies. The son of the chief is already dead. He dies to revenge him.
Yes, sir, he got shot.
Yes, so he's trying to revenge the death of his son. And so basically, he becomes a Lord Jim. He goes to this native somewhere in Malaysia, Malay Islands, a small island, and he becomes a white man who saves them, becomes their messiah, and then given the title of Tuan Jim or Lord Jim, and he's treated like one, and eventually he dies as a hero. Right? So the question that we have to ask is, which we'll discuss in the next class, is did he achieve what he set out to achieve or experience eventually? Because when he left England, he wanted to be a hero, an empire's hero, like Lord Nelson. And his first attempt at heroism failed him, proved him as a coward. And he gets a chance, then he retreats back in his life, spends many years in incognito and obscurity, but then again gets a chance. Was he always looking for a chance to redeem himself? Or was it that it happened to him and he grabbed that chance to be a hero? And if we go back, the point is, did he die a happy man? Finally redeemed. And this, can you see this highlighted? And that's the end. He passes away under a cloud, inscrutable at heart, forgotten, unforgiven, and excessively romantic. Not in the wildest days of his boyish visions could he have seen the alluring shape of such an extraordinary success. For it may very well be that in that short moment of his last proud and unflinching glance, he had beheld the face of that opportunity which, like an Eastern bride, had come veiled to his side. But we can see him, an obscure contour of fame, tearing himself out of the arms of a jealous love at the sign, at the call of his exalted egoism. Is he satisfied quite now? I wonder. We ought to know. He is one of us. And I have not stood up once like an evoked ghost to answer for his eternal constancy. Was I so very wrong after all? Now he is no more. There are days when the reality of his existence comes to me with an overwhelming force. And yet upon my honor, there are moments too when he passes from my eyes like a disembodied spirit. So Marlowe is asking these questions. Is he satisfied now? We ought to know because he's one of us. Story of Jim's is a story of all the empire soldiers, all the officers. Is he satisfied? Is his exalted egoism satisfied? This exalted egoism is referring to Jim's quest to be a hero for the empire. The romantic visions and the pictures created for men and boys like him that fed their imagination when they were growing up. This idea of colonization as a grand affair where everyone wanted to be part of it and be a hero, serve their part, do their bit. So now Marlowe is asking in his death, he's describing him as that he felt proud and unflinching, extraordinary success. Does it make sense? What I'm trying to get to you. circle that starts when he became the chief mate of Patna, a chance to be a hero, where he failed, and then he sat in the obscurity, but he gets another chance. So Marlowe is saying, was he always waiting for this? Because according to Marlowe, he knew him between years. He felt that he settled back for this boring life. But this surprised him. His eternal constancy, that he never gave up the idea. Does it make sense, Ria?
Yes, sir.
Ranveer, Shivam.
Yes, sir.
Now, when you read the entire text, now when you think about what we discussed, look at it from a different perspective. Does it help what we talked about?
Yes, sir. It completed the circle.
Ranveer, Ria?
Sir, it gave me a lot of context to understand the novel.
Yes. And we'll talk more. Ranveer?
Yes, sir. It is easier to read now.
Yeah. So now when you look at the text with these ideas, and if you just flick through and read different areas, so primarily the text is divided into three major parts. The first part is until the Patna affair. The second part is his middle life when he's in the incognito obscure mode. And the third part is the Petusan part. So the first part is where his adventurous, heroic opportunity gets lost and he's stigmatized and labeled as a coward. Then he lives his years in obscurity. But then when he gets a chance, he again goes for it and he's happy to die as a proud man. So Marlowe is calling this an extraordinary success. So that it raises a lot of questions. That when he failed initially, maybe he failed because he was not ready technically. He was so young. But his ideas of heroics were still there. His fantasy was still there. So did he carry that fantasy throughout his life, even after the Patna affair? Because in the court case, he never answered. He never explained. He never tried to explain. So was he like a stubborn kid who, even after having failed, that must have proven to him that you're not ready. This is not it. The pictures that you saw as a young boy in the magazines and the comic strips, that's not the real world. The real world is completely different. This is not all heroism. He must have understood that. But like a stubborn kid, he did not understand. He stuck to his ideas of fantasy. And even though he survived these years in silence, but he was always yearning for that opportunity to go and prove and become a lord. And when he got one, he went all the way and fulfilled his fantasy and died as an extraordinary success. That kinds of completes this understanding of this whole thing, whole text. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Cool. So we'll talk about more of these questions. Start thinking about these questions. And today is Thursday. We can have a class on. In fact, write down some answers if you can. If you can't, wait for the next class on Saturday. And we'll wrap it up on Saturday. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Cool. Thanks a lot for your time. I'm switching off now and we'll meet in the next class Saturday.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Okay, sir.